right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Wilson Center. For those of you that were looking for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's just next door, but you can probably go back and forth between. So I'm Gwen Young. I'm director of the Women in Public Service Project here at the Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you to this panel on how we get women elected. This is going to be a conversational panel because we've got a panel deep in experience globally of electing women candidates and candidates generally. And I think in this election year in the US, the big question is, are we ready? Which I think we'll come to later. We're not going to open, I believe, with that. But before I do open it, I just want to, for those of you who don't know, the Women in Public Service Project at the Wilson Center has a goal that by 2050, 50% of all public service leadership positions will be held by women. And so we and a team of 2 at the moment have this incredible goal of getting to that. And I'm going to get there with these 3 ladies on the panel. So I'm very, very excited to have them here today. Before we start, I'll do a quick bio for those of you who don't know, and we will go alphabetically, which I think. Michelle Beckering here on the end has just become the Director for Global Initiatives and Senior Gender Advisor at the International Republican Institute, IRI. She's been with IRI since 2005, if I'm correct. And was the Director of Governance. She was also the Resident Country Director for Indonesia, which I think should be an interesting discussion based on both youth and a mixture of religions and cultures. And she's also Director of the Women's Democracy Network, which we'll talk about later, but it is a network of grassroots women's organizations. So before IRI, though, she has spent numerous positions in the US government. She worked in the administration of President George Bush, serving in the European and Eurasian Affairs Directorate of the National Security Council, led by Dr. Condoleezza Rice. And then prior her time in the executive branch, she worked on Capitol Hill as an aide to Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. Thank you very much. This is my new to Washington pronunciation. Did it take you a while? It's quite the name. And as some of her awards and recognition, she was named a 2013 Top Global Woman by the Diplomatic Courier. She serves as a guest lecturer for the Gender Equality course at the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute, and she's a member of the U.S. State Department Speakers and Specialists. Happy to have you here this morning, Michelle. So joining us on Washington, but from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, I can say that. Actually, we probably should not talk about there during Brexit. Sandra Pepper is a career diplomat and international development professional. She joined NDI as the Director for Gender and Women in Democracy in 2014. And before that, she spent 13 years as a senior officer at the UK's Department for International Development, DFID. So prior to joining DFID, she spent some time in British domestic politics, lecturing in political science and international relations at the University of Ghana, and as a political analyst in the Political Affairs Division at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Much of Sandra's career has been spent working on or in transitional economies, focusing on the building of resilient and inclusive institutions. She's a member of the Cambridge Sustainability Leaders Network, the Royal Commonwealth Society, the Global Board Ready Women Initiative, and the International Advisory Board of the Commonwealth of Journal for International Affairs, the Round Table, if that's correct. She holds the Financial Times Diploma for Non-Executive Directors and serves as a trustee for the pension fund of an intergovernmental organization. Welcome, Sandra. Jessica Reese advises international and political corporate clients with Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner. Her experience in international campaigns and knowledge of politics through the developing world provide a unique service to the firm's client. Jessica has worked extensively in Latin America and most recently in Venezuela, Honduras, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic. Jessica has been with Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner since 2006 and has a specialty in focus groups and surveys in Central and South America, Western and Eastern Europe, and India and Southeast Asia. So she has done her focus groups and her political work in particularly challenging environments. In 2010, she led Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner's first research in Iraq, conducting trainings for Iraqi nationals in advance of Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner's focus groups and surveys. And in 2012, she designed a similar program in Yemen. Reese got her bachelor's degree in comparative economics from the Wall School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, has lived in Argentina, speaks Spanish, and is the unofficial team captain for Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner's pub trivia team. We have to keep it light. Welcome, Jessica. Very important. So, yeah.
I feel bad because we should at least say out loud something about Gwen. If you don't mind, I'm going to just do a simple précis from yours so that people can hear it out loud as well. So Gwen Young, our esteemed host, is currently the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and Women in Public Service project here at the Wilson Center. She's an international development professional with over 20 years of experience in international public service, an alumna of Smith College, Harvard, and the University of California. Wow.
A lot of student loans.
King Junior School of Law, and she's pursued a career in humanitarian relief.
You all need to use your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, there you go.
Humanitarian relief, international development, and human rights. Her career has encompassed a comprehensive array of international organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Médecins Sans Frontières, International Rescue Committee, and the Harvard Institute for International Development. She has published in the field of international human rights and international criminal law, is a member of a long list of international legal organizations, including term membership at the Council on Foreign Relations, the Executive Board of the American Society of International Law, and several legal bars in California and Europe. So you know where to go if you need a lawyer. Additionally, Ms. Young has spoken before the UN Commission on Human Rights. So that's Gwen as well.
Wow, thank you very much.
Very impressive, but how do you do with pub?
I was going to
Trivia.
say, so we're going to start with pub tonight because I'm definitely not good at trivia. Yeah, why don't you, Jessica, why don't you tell us a bit about Greenberg, Quinlan, and Rosner's work and focusing specifically on your political clients?
Well, great, and Gwen, thank you for having me. Michelle and Sandra, it's an honor to share the stage with you both. I admire the work that you guys do in training and developing and really pushing democracy on the front lines. So I really appreciate that, and it helps what I do and gives me hope for the future. Before I answer your question, I want to start with a number because I'm a pollster. The number I want to start with, 204. In 204 days, the most powerful person on the planet is going to be a woman. And
You should clap, right? Everyone's a bit silent.
I just think that's remarkable. And I think that, that fact makes me very hopeful. And I think, I'm sure, Sandra and Michelle and Gwen feel the same way. A lot of times when we travel a lot in the developing world, there's a lot to be pessimistic about. And, situations that women find themselves in, that political systems that, are maturing, find themselves in, it's easy to get down and think, how is this going to get better? How can we help make things better? But, in 204 days, every woman on the planet is going to have a tremendous role model. And I think that's going to be very important. So I'm excited. And, we can talk about kind of other reasons why I'm hopeful, but that's something I just want to start with to hopefully let us all take a step back and see where we are. So Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner Research, we're a political consulting and polling firm. We're based here in Washington. We have offices in London, Toronto, and New York. What we do is we do public opinion research. We do focus groups and surveys, and we use that data to help advise campaigns on campaign strategy, broadly, but on other things, message development, speech writing, debate prep, kind of the whole architecture of a campaign. We got our start in 1980. My mentor, Stan Greenberg, started working for Chris Dodd and really helped in the 80s the New Democrats, kind of modernizing the Democratic Party, and then kind of was brought in 1992 as Bill Clinton's pollster. From there, went to work with Tony Blair, Nelson Mandela, Ehud Barak in Israel. Here in the U.S., we work exclusively for Democrats. We're working on Senate races, congressional races, and we're particularly proud. We work for a lot of organizations that are dedicated to electing women. Emily's List, and many others. We work for Debbie Stabenow, Jean Shaheen, Amy Klobuchar, Senate hopefuls Tammy Baldwin, Maggie Hassan, former congressional leaders Mary Landrieu, Gabby Giffords, Betty Sutton. So we're really proud of the female candidates we have elected through our work. Additionally, we're one of the only polling firms that I know of that has a dedicated team that, multilingual, multinational pollsters and campaign professionals dedicated to doing, this, outside the U.S. So I will say we haven't worked with as many female candidates internationally as I would like, and I can tell you my theories on why. But our clients have included, former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard, former President of Malawi Joyce Banda, former Israeli Labour Party leader Shelly Yakimovich, former Foreign Affairs Minister Maria Emma Mejia of Colombia, and a few others. So that's what we do, and I'm excited to talk more. But it's a very different point of view, I think, from IRI and NDI. But we do overlap in a lot of things.
I think that's interesting. I think we can, Michelle, one of the things Jessica was talking about was the public opinion research. And one of the things that I think IRI has extensive experience with through the networks is what motivates young people to go in. Can you talk a bit about that, about what motivates young people and what IRI does with identifying who wants to run for office?
Oh, great question. And public opinion polling is so important, both when we're looking at the work we do here in the United States as well as overseas. And I'm glad you asked the question about young people. And I know today we have a group of students here from Howard. Is that correct? Howard University? So let me ask a question. So, and there's many other young people in the room, but if I were to say, how many of you have thought of running for office? Raise your hand. Okay. It's notable, I would say, though.
Better than I expected.
Better than we expected, but probably still less than a quarter in the room. And that's here in the United States, where we would say our opportunities are probably, well, they are a lot easier than a lot of the young people will face overseas. But this is a big part of the issue. When we look at campaigns, and especially when we're talking about this issue of getting more women elected, if we're waiting to start until the electoral season in a country, we've waited too long. This is a holistic process. If I were to say there was a recipe for success, and I'm always very hesitant to do that, it's that we need an inclusive process. We have to start now. We have to start with young people in universities, even in high schools. And so what we do through the Women's Democracy Network, which is our program globally, is we work, first of all, at the first step in working with young people, especially in universities, young people in their careers, to actually talk about what is politics. United States, there's a lot of surveys that are done here as well, and Jessica maybe has more statistics on that than I do, but it's not popular. If you ask a lot of young people, are you interested in running for office? Are you interested in a political career? Most of them will actually say no, and that's true overseas as well. So what we need to do is sort of reframe this conversation. Do people really understand what it means to be in public office? Oftentimes, due to the rancor of our political parties in our systems here in the United States as well as abroad, politics becomes a very dirty word. It's contentious, it's very bipartisan, no one gets along, there's no consensus. So what we need to look at is really helping people understand the government, especially in our democracies, this is a right, but it's a responsibility of all the people, especially the young people. If you want your politicians and your elected leaders to represent your voices, you have to be part of that dialogue. And so one of the things we look at is making sure young people also understand it isn't just necessarily us calculating how many young people or how many women are running for office. Politics is bigger than that. Are you directly affecting legislation, public discourse, issue advocacy? Politics is much bigger than just passing legislation. And frankly, if you have members of office who you don't think are representing you, that's the great responsibility of anyone in our country or overseas to use their voice, not only at the ballot box, but among that entire electoral season.
Sandra, tell me, what's specific to women or women candidates in your work? What have you found either from how they view politics or what they view as the barriers to running for office?
Thanks, Gwen. I think, let me first pick up on Michelle's point about the number of you young people in the room who are thinking about politics. There's a fabulous piece of work done by Jennifer Lawless, so you can all look her up. And it's shocking at some level. What she's found with some research that she's done is that if you go to high school, 2/3 of all students aren't interested in leadership or politics, fine. But of the third that are, it's 50-50, boys and girls. By the time you all graduate from college, it's like 80% of all students say, nah, we're not doing politics, of which 98% of them are women. So your 20% is virtually all male, and they are all ready to run the next day. They graduate day one and they're ready to run the next day. So we are interested in looking at what happens. Why is it that all those young women with leadership potential and who've been doing leadership things, whether it's, captaining your team or being on the student council or being a counselor, whatever it is that they were doing at high school, by the time they graduate from college, all that leadership, which is what it's about, it's leadership, that leadership ambition, that leadership drive has gone. So we need to understand that better. And we find this around the world. This isn't just a US thing. It's not even just a developed economy thing. It happens around the world. And the barriers to women's engagement range from things like education. Some women feel they're not adequately educated. There are issues around finance. There are issues around time. As you know, in many countries around the world, women are still predominantly the caregivers and those who work the domestic environment. We always say that politics is like, the third shift. Really, it's, after you've done your housework, after you've looked after your family and children, and some of them are actually even working outside the home as well, then seriously, now you're going to have time and energy to get into politics. So the time poverty of women is a huge barrier too. The institutions aren't particularly friendly. Lots of political parties aren't very friendly to women unless they are making tea or, in lots of places you'll see them as sort of praise singers and, there's lots of colorful women sort of sashaying down the street. That's okay. One of our examples came from Latin America, where a woman activist said, yeah, we have a women's wing in this party, but it's used to organize women, not as a women's organization. And there's a difference. That's a big difference, okay? So there are things about the political institutions that are also problematic. And when we do work in country, and I think as Michelle will attest to, we look at three things. We look at women's individual capacity. And again, in the United States, we know it takes a woman to be asked 7 times before she'll stand for any kind of office. And she won't even acknowledge that she's been in a leadership position most of the time before that. So there's an issue about individual levels of confidence and ability. We look at the institutions. So is the electoral code friendly to women? Are women able to register to vote? In Burkina Faso, we found that a lot of women couldn't register to vote. Why? Because they didn't have birth certificates. Because in Burkina Faso, nobody registers the birth of a girl child. It's not important. So we had to work with the activists, with the parties, with the Electoral Commission itself to get women's birth certificates in order for them to be able to go then and register to vote. So we look at the institutions of politics, and then we also look at the sociocultural environment. And again, I think particularly in the spread of online campaigning, of the whole Facebook and social media stuff, I think you'll all realize the importance of how women are depicted, how women are talked about, how women can be attacked in very personal and upsetting ways through a general permissiveness in our societies, that says it's okay actually to talk about a woman's clothing or, the pitch of her voice. It's okay to Photoshop her head onto a half-clad bikini body. By the way, she's working in Malaysia, and this is devastating. That sort of misrepresentation can be devastating to a woman's whole life, not just her political life. So those are the sorts of things that we find when we work around the world.
So let's focus on the institution piece for a second. Looking at electoral systems, looking at the governance systems. And Michelle, maybe we'll start with you, but where's your entry point and what's in that system and what are the best practices? And what's specific to having a female candidate? Certain things like who the voters are, and what's not specific? What's just a part of sort of good electoral practices?
No, it's a great question, and I think we even, look at it outside of sort of the gender realm. So one of the big issues we're facing in our wider work around the world is that there's a lot of predominant still of personality politics versus issue politics. This, in a democracy, continues to be really concerning, and not only for women, but it affects women specifically. When you have countries, and our country is another example, where primarily you have had men in leadership positions in governments and political parties, there becomes even a cultural sort of, feeling that that's what a leader looks like. But what we've really got to change the discourse there is, what are the issues? Are these leaders really representing your issues? And so one of the things we really strive, and again, this is a larger process. We say women, getting to women's parity, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And one of the issues is really working with those institutions. I'll give a quick example from Indonesia, where I spent several years working on a nationwide campaign to try to increase the number of women running and elected to office. One of the biggest issues there was working with the male party leaders to help them understand two things. The first was that in Indonesia, there had been electoral laws that had been passed. We talk a lot about gender quotas. I'll just touch briefly, but in Indonesia, they had passed a law that's saying no less than 30% of all the names on the list had to be women. Well, large part of our job was doing issue advocacy, first of all, working with the political parties to help them understand that was the law. So they needed to include these women, but then helping them understand these have to be viable candidates. Who is this? It's not just saying, well, I know women who are, my wife, my cousin, my sister, I'll just put them on the list. Who are candidates who are driven, who are part of the fabric of the party, who have community networks, et cetera, and helping them to understand what a candidate looks like. A larger part of that, again, is it's really not even about gender. It's saying it's issue advocacy. If you are in Kalimantan, do you really understand, if you're sitting in Jakarta, in Java, where the capital is, do you really understand what the needs are of the people there? When you're putting lists together, you're looking at representatives of the people. That's specifically true with women. Women are 50% of the world's population. If you even break down the statistics, oftentimes women are the leaders in civil society groups, grassroots organizations in countries. And so looking and saying, these are your community activists. These are people who very, very succinctly understand the needs of the populace. These are what are ideal candidates. And I have to say, and I'll be very frank here, sometimes it's about painting it as the winning strategy. We look at it in a business term. And I talk a lot about the women candidates and say, we're going to sort of objectify you for a moment. Not that you're a woman, but that you're a winning candidate. And we're going to use your gender to that advantage. Look at your networks, look at your social fabric, look at your role as a mother and what that has taught you about education, about healthcare, about the needs in this community. And that's what we're going to use to our advantage. Sandra talked about self-confidence earlier. That is really, really difficult with women here in the United States as well. And when you break it down, we spend a lot of time breaking down with women, asking the targeted questions, because we don't often think of the fact that we've run a PTA. That's leadership. Right, that's politics. And so helping them see that. But so that's where it's really important to work within your structures. It's also working to make sure with the women's, but two important factors, and Sandra already pointed out to this, are women's wings of political parties and youth wings. As Sandra said, it's a lot of times us working with those political parties and saying, do you understand the wealth you have in these two organizations? Oftentimes, those women's organizations are well mobilized, they're well connected, but they're not well funded. They're sort of set aside until the elections come along and the party suddenly needs 30% of the list to be names of women. And so we actually do a lot of work with capacity building for both youth as well as women's organizations. We want them to play a really integral part in that party, not just at the election season, but throughout the cycle. Because once we can get the political parties to really understand the advantage and the role they play, it's a better entree for both women and youth in the elections.
Jessica, sort of issue advocacy, the winning candidate, and perhaps your point of entry, you or Greenberg, Quinlan, and Raja might be a bit different, where perhaps a candidate calls you. Can you talk about that dynamic a bit?
So for me, it's exciting to hear Sandra and Michelle talk about cultivating candidates, getting women educated and involved, and compelling them to run. By the time I usually see female candidates, they've been convinced. So it's exciting to hear. But beyond kind of internal issues, women face some big public opinion barriers and kind of what people think of women leaders, and it varies throughout the world. The World Values Survey is, a pretty, very good, robust series of data across different countries, across years. They ask a question, do you agree or disagree that men are better suited to be political leaders? I'm paraphrasing that a little bit. But, and there's some really encouraging bright spots. Of course, in Western Europe and in Northern Europe, majorities disagree. In Latin America, where there have been a new class of leaders to varying degrees of success, it's only about a quarter of people say men are the best political leaders. We get to places Asia, obviously the Middle East, and 80% of people say only men are suited to be political leaders. So I mean, part of that is seeing role models. But that's a big public opinion hurdle that we have to face and convince voters that this is viable. One thing about that is with female leaders, and we all know this intuitively, but there are more thresholds to hit. When we talk about attributes for leaders, there are two kinds. There are threshold attributes and then comparative ones. There are certain things, for example, if you're about to elect the President of the United States, there's threshold. They need to be credible as commander-in-chief. They need to be credible with the nuclear codes. And only once they hit those bars, then you can say, okay, who cares about me more? Which would do a better job on the economy? But you need to hit those threshold issues. Dukakis never went anywhere because he never hit that threshold of who would be a better leader on national security or commander-in-chief. With women, perception of women, they have more thresholds to hit on national security, on crime, on on toughness, on these kind of issues that women tend to be weaker on. And I think because of that, it forces some women, and especially Democratic women, to take harder right stances than they normally would, just because they have to hit those thresholds. So that's one thing. But the flip side, women have this advantage on social issues, but often get boxed into that, and I think that's a challenge. Just to give a quick example, we were doing focus groups for one of the senators we're working to elect this year. And we did an exercise, and what we did was, it was after kind of an hour into the group, and we gave all the participants a list of accomplishments of this woman, and she had a high-profile position, and it was maybe 10 things, and they were economic development, reduced crime in her state, sponsored a bill on crime. There was one social issue in there, but of the 10, 9 out of 10 were economic, security, things like that. People discussed it, looked at it, we took it away, and then we asked, okay, for this candidate, what issues do you think she would do particularly well on, in the Senate? Oh, education, health. And we were just like, we had just shown them all her record on economic issues, security issues, but still, because she was a woman, that's kind of where their heads went initially. So, and not even initially, after seeing all those things. So there is, women often get boxed into these issues, which can be a strength, but it's hard to kind of get out of that when you're talking about voters and convincing them and building a policy program.
Also, sort of once they get into office and then where they get put, depending if they're not the president. I want to switch gears just a little bit. Sandra, can we talk a bit about potentially two things, sort of the system itself, a democracy versus an authoritarian regime, the role that that plays in elections, and with that a little bit of, Michelle brought up legislation, and so how much that matters, whether there's mandated parity, whether there's quotas. I know this is a US audience, but I feel like we should touch upon that because you can talk about that in the rest of the world. But can you talk a bit about what impact the type of regime or the type of governance structure and legislation will make in the actual sort of election piece of this?
Thanks. I mean, I think, let me just start where 18 months ago I started this job, and I was given, the first presentation I was supposed to make. And the first slide said, why women? And I said, no, people, it's why politics first. So for the last 18 months, I've been going, oh, why politics, and then why women? And now I feel like it's kind of why politics, why women, and then why politics for women? Because the world is turning and changing, and there is sort of an assumption out there that actually economic empowerment is all that women need. And it ain't. You have to have the politics. And when we are looking at different political contexts, we are trying to place where women are in those contexts. So if you have basically a closed regime with no space for civil society, any civil society to organize, that means any activist group, whether it's a church group or a media group or whatever it is, then actually you have an increased barrier for women. Because as Michelle said, we know that a lot of women come into politics because of their roles at community level, at grassroots level, and so forth. So if that space is closed, then you are actually effectively closing off one particular route forward for women to come through. So the nature and the context of the politics does matter very much. We know, for example, in the case of a transitioning country, and I won't name it, but the point was when they went to the Constitutional Conference, their delegation was 50-50 men and women. After a long and very bitter and hard conflict, they went to their Constitutional Conference, this particular party, 50-50 women. But in the elections that followed, which were deemed to be very tight elections and very competitive elections, suddenly the lists became like 30-70. So 30% women, 70% men. Because there is a perception that the public won't vote for women in tight political contexts. So that, political party leaders sort of revert to, no, we need men here now. It's tough. It's going to get tough. We need men. But actually, what we hear from the publics, as Jessica said, is that most publics around the world will accept a woman leader as long as she's been demonstrated to be a leader. So that's the sorts of issues that we try and contend with when we're trying to shift thinking on the social norms. In Georgia in Europe, not Georgia down here, in Georgia, our office did some public opinion research, and they found that, and I'm going to caricature it a bit, but when the average Georgian woke up in the morning, he or she thought, yeah, women, men, 50-50 leadership, it's fine. But by the time they'd gone to sleep, almost, it was like, oh, no, we're not having women in positions. And what had happened between waking and sleeping? It's that sociocultural piece, how women were portrayed in the media, how women were talked about. They didn't see women on public platforms dealing with the hard issues. So in a way, the environment affected them every day. And so when our team looked at it, they said, this is not then about campaign schools for women leadership. It's not about working with political parties. It's about changing the perception of women in the broad society. And they targeted their program towards the media and changing that perception in the media. So again, when we're looking at this, there are very many different moving parts, and understanding where your intervention is going to be is based on the political context you're working in and some analysis of institutions, individuals, and sociocultural context.
Michelle, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
No, and Sandra, I agree with everything she said, and I know. It'd be more interesting if I didn't. But one of the things, and I was thinking as Sandra was talking, and it's exactly this idea of changing the norm. If you look at, let's look at the continent of Africa, and if you look at the 12 countries that have the highest percentage of women represented in their parliament, 8 of those 12 have, within the last 2 decades, undergone a civil or liberation war. What does that tell us? You look at Rwanda. Rwanda is an example of a country where right now they have the highest in the entire world of women's representation. And a lot of people will say, well, they have a quota. They've outperformed their quota by almost 30%. What happens in these countries is when people woke up the morning after the war, they started looking at each other differently. These women, and we can look at South Sudan, we can look at Rwanda, we can look at so many of these countries, were fighting side by side with their brothers, for the liberation, for the transfer of power, for human rights, for a democratic system. And in the society, people started looking at them differently. They started looking, there was no longer the gender division. It was basically everyone working together side by side for this change. So when it came the opportunity to actually create these new government institutions, gender was no longer the deciding motivating factor. They were looked at for what role they had played, which was very little different from the men. And unfortunately, in countries, and Rwanda is another example, because of the high death rates in so many of these wars, you found that women were primarily the head of households because there had been so many men killed. So again, and it's an unfortunate and it's a drastic example, but you saw through tragedy women's gender roles being very changed. And so that's oftentimes a factor. And when you look at that, I think we oftentimes look at, well, what does that mean for the larger development community? Another really interesting example, my foreign policy background started in democratic development in the former Soviet republics. There, the communist parties instill in the countries today where we have communist political systems, there were gender quotas, at least of 30%. And so when we were working in the democratic institutions in a lot of these countries, I assumed that was still going to be a very popular notion, but it wasn't. In those countries, because of that tie to a previous government system where people felt they actually didn't have choice, the women were the primary opponents calling for no quotas, because they saw that as a restrictive environment when you were told who had to represent you. And so in their countries, they said, we don't want that anymore. We want to be able to be free to choose who best represents us. But I think that is kind of a challenge in the work we do because it isn't a cookie cutter approach. We very much, when we go into the countries where we work, we have to work with our partners to understand what are those political experiences, what is the social culture, what are the factors that go into what they see as leadership, but also what they see as choice.
Let's bring it back to the U.S. for a second. Jessica, I'm going to sort of ask you the hard question about the systems. I mean, here in the U.S., I think the figure is something like 2/3 of the women in Congress come from New York and California. So that tells us a lot about our electoral college. What's our quote-unquote hope? When we put up the gender parity slides in terms of our electoral system, I don't think quotas are an option here in the U.S. necessarily, but what can we do from a system side or from where you sit to increase the chances of, and I will say, both Democratic and Republican women getting elected, because it's much higher on the Democratic side.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, Sandra, you're talking about, people in Georgia wake up thinking there's parity and go to sleep because all the images around them. I think, the reason why you have to ask a woman 7 times to run for office is because there aren't role models. And I think, one thing that makes me hopeful about, the U.S. situation is that there are, we're hitting a tipping point, I hope. And, hopefully, the president will help in that. We're electing, senators and congressional leaders in big numbers. But I also think, creating role models. I also think there's no mistake that one of the, best female political leaders of our time, Nancy Pelosi, she grew up in, in a time when, her father was, a leg-breaking mayor of Baltimore. And so she saw that political, firsthand growing up, was immersed in it. And maybe not a female role model, but she saw what it looked like. You look at some other, exceptional female leaders, Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, they grew up in political families and saw this firsthand. So I think some people, are maybe dismissive of that and say, they got to where they were because of their family. That may be part of it, but I think it's more because, it's so hard for women to see themselves in these roles that when you're part of a family and you can see it firsthand, it helps and you can imagine yourself in those places. In the U.S., though, what I think is, interesting. So going back on quotas, like what you said, quotas probably aren't going to happen here. I think, I have a hard time with quotas. I'm skeptical of them because, as a progressive woman, of course, there's a part of me that says, yes, 51, 52% of the population, we need to have equal representation. Part of me as a woman says, but I don't want, women should be judged on their own merits and not be put in a place. And, of course, there are different quotas, quotas of opportunity versus quotas of, candidates, and whether they, and it can be pretty, tricky what parties will do and put all the women at the bottom of the list so none of them get elected. One recent thing that that I thought was really interesting, in Italy in 2011, they instituted quotas, but only at the local level, like the city council level. And then just recently, they had elections last month. The mayor of Rome, the mayor of Turin, 2 women, they came into power, in that, 2011, 2012 was their class, and largely because there was that quota system for city councils, and they rose through. So in terms of building the bench, I think, quotas might have a role at lower levels and getting people, more involved. In the U.S., there are kind of NGO actors. The Emerge program is something that does, training for female candidates. I think that's kind of our version of that, at least.
Sandra, I think you want to jump in here.
Yeah,
nobody ever says to a man, start at the local council level and rise up, you know. So I have a problem with the idea that, you know, the local level should be a training ground for women. I was at a women's workshop last year, and a woman got up, she said, yeah, you know, the thing about women is, you know, when we get up and we look at ourselves in the mirror, we see, you know, wrinkle, spot, you know, false eyelash. And when a man gets up and looks himself in the mirror, what he sees is commander-in-chief, next general, next. I mean, there's a thing about how we actually perceive ourselves and what we look at. And you know, I always say we raise our young girls to be accommodating and accepting, and to expect everybody to like them. And we almost raise our young boys to accept that not everybody will like them. And actually, it's a very good thing, because you've got to be competitive and you've got to be tough and you've got to have a hard skin to make it. So this business about the gender culture is important. And I think Michelle talked about how moments of opportunity in political crises are aligned to allow women to come through into more representative roles. But unfortunately, two things happen. There can be reversals. You can lose that advantage. And what we often don't see is, for example, a drop in domestic-based violence. So the social-cultural pieces aren't changing necessarily just because you have more women in power. And I think that that's something we have to keep thinking about, because if we change the gender roles, we actually transform society for everybody, you know. We liberate both men and women from harmful gendered practices. And I think that that is a stronger message that we have to start getting across. Because in some societies, and I think both Gwen and Jessica talked about this, in some societies you've got a huge preponderance of thinking that women's role is not in the public space. It's not even in politics, it's just not in the public space. And how do we switch that? How do we take an opportunity to change that kind of thinking? And it is going to be about the fact that actually liberating women from those roles is important for everybody. We did a small pilot study in Morocco recently, which wasn't related to the topic we're talking about. But what was interesting there was that young men and all women felt the same marginalization and exclusion, because the leadership in Morocco is largely held by older men. So, you know, it's not just women, it's everybody who's not an older man, in a way, who's excluded. And this business about how we make all our politics, wherever we are, more representative of the whole society is an important one. But what you don't want is for those young men to continue to grow in a sort of a perspective that says, my biggest challenge to my leadership is women.
As women, absolutely.
You know, because that's, if you don't do something, that's exactly the dynamic that will continue. And that becomes, you know, another generational hurdle. Social norm change is glacial anyway. It really takes a long time. But, you know, what we can try and do is move the needle generation by generation, so that, you know, over time you have, you end up in a different place. I think that's the key thing.
And I think inclusion is key to that. But you also brought up another thing that we sort of talked about earlier, which is the time burden, and like the political economy is going to look very different if you have 50 by 50 representation, just from policies and time and labor and who's doing what. I think we've got about 15 minutes left, and it looks like we have an audience that's been nodding or smiling, and potentially some hands. So we'd like to take some questions. I believe that there are microphones across the room. There's, in order to guide the microphones, there's a gentleman here in the front to my right. Right here. We'll start with you, sir, and then, and we'll probably take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll answer, because that'll give us a chance to think and write down some answers. And if we can, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us where you come from or what chair you're sitting in, so to speak.
Okay, I'm in the second row from the front. I'm in the chair. If you're looking towards the front, I'm all the way to the far left. And my name is Mark Greenberg, and I run a news service for unions, which is unions in the U.S. are almost 50% women, although leadership is another matter. There are very few women leaders. I was making a list of those countries that in both present and past had been led by women. Started it before we came in, kept going. I came up with about around 20. Virtually all of them democracies. But another interesting fact stood out. Only one, Argentina of all places, has had 2 women leaders. Ms. Kirchner, and before her, Evita Perón. And so I want you to talk about that. Not just the pipeline, but once you get in the pipeline, how to continue, how to make sure one succeeds, another succeeds, another succeeds, another.
Absolutely. And there's so many issues involved in that, from the family and perceptions. The women here in the front row, I don't know if we should just pass the mic or... Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I am Fatima Jafari. I am a member of Provincial Council from Herat province from Afghanistan, and second time I participate to the election directly, and I got vote and elected. I think in Middle East, in Afghanistan, we have some other kind of challenge in front of women. For example, influential warlord in our country have a deep impact to destiny of the women who want to elected to the provincial council, parliament, or other places. Other challenges is religion. I think in Middle East, especially in Afghanistan also, the religion also is another big challenge in front of women. And every religious leader can beat women candidate with a little sentence about the women, about the religion of the women, and security. Security also, I think, another big challenge in Afghanistan. I think a big challenge for Afghan women and also women in Middle East is a corruption. Corruption, another big challenge, because all official men supported the men candidate, and after that, the men candidate enter to the cycle of the corruption. And this cycle again and again support the men candidate and also men official, and this is a cycle. And I think I want to say hear something about these challenges in some country, especially for example in Afghanistan or Middle East, how we can deal with these challenges, and how we can solve these challenges for helping to other women, for making some good policy for next women in our countries. Thank you so much for your time.
I think actually those two questions are kind of related, and I have a figure that I have seen sometimes is I think in 2010 in the elections in Afghanistan, every woman who ran received some threat of bodily violence. So I think that
some man candidate had a good relation with the warlord, with insurgency group, and paid some money or something, and they said they don't let to some specific women to came to this area for campaign. I had same this problem. For first time I got 6,000 votes. For second time I got just 5,000 votes, because some other men candidates has good relation with insurgent group, with the Taliban in the some special area, and they didn't let me to going for campaign.
yeah, there's a violence piece, there's a network, and this goes back to sort of the once you're in power and your perception, when you're there, the perception, I think the women are less corrupt perception. I've talked with several of us about that. Who wants to start? Jessica, I think you were.
Sure. So, to your question, I've been thinking a lot about, electing that first national leader is such a challenge, but electing the second one, just seems so insurmountable. And, Argentina's done it. Philippines has elected 2 female leaders. Sri Lanka, more prime ministers have been elected. Like Poland has elected 2 prime ministers. Bangladesh has elected 2 female prime ministers. But again, people aren't voting directly there, so it's a little bit different. It's hard. And one thing that really struck me, I was looking at this World Values Survey I mentioned. there are countries that have had female leaders that, majorities said that men were better leaders. In Thailand, I think it was 55% of people said that men do a better job as leaders. Yingluck Shinawatra was Prime Minister of Thailand. In the Philippines, it was a high number. In India and Pakistan. So it's hard because I think, when you are the first women leader of any country, you are also, that candidate is also a partisan figure who is, luckily is, judged on her own merit, but then that becomes what a female leader looks like in that country. So it's hard, the second one is hard. And then the third one, is hard. But then I hope it gets a little bit easier. And I think, in the same, a generation ago here, who were the women on the national political stage more than a generation? Or, with Geraldine Ferraro, Ann Richards, but that was kind of the only model of, what a, national female leader looked like. But now there are all kinds of, U.S. female leaders that kind of, the second and the third kind of come up. How to balance religion and female leaders, that's, very hard. One thing, I don't have an answer, but one thing I'll say, when we did work in Yemen, one thing that really surprised us, and this is in 2012, we asked people, do you believe there should be Sharia law in Yemen? And an overwhelming majority of people said yes. It was 80% of something. And then, later on, we asked, do you think, after this national dialogue and we build a new government, should there be quotas for women? 80% said yes, there should be quotas to have more women political participation, including majorities of men. That really surprised me that those two views could be consistent with one another. So that gave me a little bit of hope. And of course, in religious societies, it's harder, and the battles are different. The battle lines.
And the networks are often the male religious leaders, which don't help that.
One other note on the first question, I think, and Jessica you answered it really well, and I don't want to put too fine of a point on it, but we tend to, with national leaders, look at women's gender, but we don't do that with men. So for example, you were talking about, it is really hard if you're that first or second woman, because when we talk about Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Thailand's a good example, people will associate, if they didn't like the politics of that leader, no, they didn't like her because she was a woman. And I hear this all the time. We work in over 80 countries right now doing gender programming, and we hear this all the time. If you talk about male candidates, like let's look in the United States, if you look at the a Republican past president and a Democratic past president, people will have a lot of vitriol against them, but we never look at the fact that they're men. We'll not like them because they were a Democrat or Republican. But because there's still so few women, we look at their gender versus the fact that, well, actually no one liked them because they were from party X and they didn't like their ideology, et cetera. But I find that really interesting, and as Jessica said, it's just going to take for there to be more women for us to stop looking at their gender as the characteristic we don't like. Then I want to go to Afghanistan, and first of all, I mean, you are an inspiration to me. I mean, I think it's very easy, for, and I'll talk for myself, I feel sometimes very humbled, like it's very easy for me to say, this is how we get more women elected. I have never been in your shoes. And in all the work I have done for IRI, I will have to say Afghanistan weighs always most heavy on my heart. And one of the things I learned after some of the trainings we were doing, both at the provincial level, but specifically with women in your national parliament, is that the American experience is not going to be the experience that, best helps. And, even my thinking about quota was really drafted by a dear friend of mine, Nahid Fareed, who is the youngest woman member of the Afghanistan parliament. And she said to me, Michelle, you just have to understand, in countries like ours, we wouldn't be here if there weren't the quota. She said, I think I am fully capable of running, but it's still that social, and as you're saying, there's so many factors in this country that just would barrier and not let me get there. And so she was really helpful in helping me even understand how in those situations the quota is, sort of that fast track to making sure women can get there. And then you talked about a couple things that I feel are really, really poignant, and that is corruption and religion. And one of the things I want to talk about in corruption, and I'm not going to talk about Afghanistan, but one of the things we did in Indonesia, corruption and money politics. So in Indonesia, money politics is the term they use, and that's basically money for votes. The issue there is voters expect that. I mean, they get nothing from their parliamentarians. They feel they don't often see them because Java is very far away. So if you're out in one of the islands, every 4 years when the party comes around and hosts, barbecues or, gives small goods, that's maybe the most they're going to get out of their parliamentarian. And that's kind of a negative characterization of Indonesian parliaments, and I don't mean that. But so what we try to teach people is your elected official should be showing up here more than once every 4 years. But one of the biggest issues we find is that women, so when I was working with women in our IRI program in Indonesia, we recognized that it was the money politics was their biggest barrier. And so what we worked with them is to run what we called clean campaigns, because our polling, and we do a lot of polling as well, showed that 90% of voters in Indonesia, the primary issue they were most upset about was the prevalence of corruption. And they felt that that was the biggest sort of impetus to, keeping democratic development and all these great gains they had made. So we worked with the candidates to really understand that running clean campaigns and really, reaching out to that 90% of the voters who understood that issue was a winning strategy. However, that's very great in its ideology, but what we have to do, and we have experience with this in Mongolia, one of the first things that women, the women candidates we worked with in the last election, and the elections are going on right now, is that working with those women once they are elected, and this is the one time I'll really stress that, is working with them to pass legislation that roots out corruption. So for instance, one of the first legislative initiatives that the women parliamentarians in Mongolia did after the last election was to try to pass constitution or electoral legislative reform that actually cut out that paying to get on party lists and to make it a much more transparent system. But that's not a quick fix, right? That's really looking at what are the legislative opportunities, but still knowing corruption and money buying is still going to happen. And the last thing I'll say is, you brought up the warlords. And again, well, we don't have really that experience. I can talk a little bit about what we did in northern Jordan in 2011. And there, it was actually really interesting to me. I was working with several of the tribes in northern Jordan, and they were starting to run women as candidates. And I found that fascinating. And so as I was driving around and meeting with some of these tribes, I was saying, well, how come you've decided now to run one of the women of the tribe of a candidate and not the men? And it was really interesting, and they actually cited there the fact that there was an open competition for women's seats in the parliament. And they realized by the sheer numbers of women and men in their tribes that they could have the numbers to actually elect someone to the parliament. And so there it was really fascinating because the tribes were, again, they were looking at gender, but they were looking at, no, what's the winning strategy here? And it was fascinating to me to see that there the tribes were less concerned about it being a man or a woman, but who had the most viable chance of getting elected. And so for us, it was really, again, learning how to go into that culture and who were, in some senses, and I'm going to use the term, although this can be negative, who are the power brokers? And that there. Religion, maybe someone else will talk to. That's very difficult. And again, I think that's where Americans are very cautious when we go in and do prescriptions in countries. We're not a predominantly a Muslim country. We're predominantly Christian. And I think a lot of the women's empowerment work we have done in the Arab Middle East, especially through one of our initiatives we call the Arab Women's Leadership Institute, is actually using other women, other religious women, let's say here of the Muslim faith to actually be the mentor and to actually work with women in other Muslim countries to say, this is how we've been able to work with our Muslim leaders who have actually been extremely supportive of our initiatives. And there's a lot of really wonderful women Muslim scholars that we've been able to work with as well. But we do recognize for an American to go in and say, let me tell you how we're going to work with the religious leaders, it's a terrible strategy. We do not understand that. And so I think for us, that has been really helpful. And frankly, it would be working with women like you who have actually been elected to office. You're a recipe for success. We have a large component of our programming that's on mentoring because a woman like yourself will best understand what it took to get to where you are, better than someone like myself.
Sandra, I feel like kind of a last thought, no cost campaign, anything particular you want to give you a chance to plug some of NDI's work?
Well, no, I think I would just piggyback on what Jessica said about, electing the first. And really, it's a crossover between Jessica and Michelle's points. Sustainability at the moment will probably require some kind of quota. I mean, Great Britain had its first female prime minister Margaret Thatcher, we all know her, Iron Lady, 1979, and whatever it is, and not a one since. And actually, it wasn't until 1997 that you had a big increase in women, even in the parliament. And that's because the Labour Party decided to undergo a voluntary quota, a party quota that said on 50% of the lists in winnable seats, you had to have women selected as candidates. And that meant a big step forward. And even the Conservative Party's own renewal has pushed women. So we, in the UK, we now have the largest number of women in Parliament ever. But that has been because parties have understood two things. First of all, the need to give that sort of leg up in a way, but also the electoral benefits of having a broader selection of people as candidates. Your point about Afghanistan, echo everything that Michelle said, and that's why looking at the context is very important, because whilst there are always opportunities in post-conflict reconstruction to allow women to come through, we also know that in parliaments and representation post-conflict, the number of women falls. And that's because the women's experience of violence and insecurity is different. It's very, very different. And women's perception of it is different. Just as women's experience of political corruption is different. Whereas vote buying is always wrong, whereas buying your political candidature in a party is always wrong, men may have to make a monetary decision about that. Women will probably have to make a decision based on whether or not they're going to give sex for that candidature. So even women's experience of political corruption can be gendered, as women's experience of political violence is gendered. And I think to illustrate that last point, I like to use the example of, unfortunately, Uganda. It was reported in the papers, so I'm not telling stories out of school, but last February, political party rally, men and women of the opposition going on a political rally. The security forces, came and harassed them, set upon them, beat them up. At that point, you were talking about political violence, yes? Everybody's getting manhandled and so forth. But at the point at which they took the woman leader aside and somehow she ended up stripped naked in public, now you're talking about something different. That is a gendered form of violence, because stripping a woman naked, any woman naked in public, is a gendered form of violence. And they took her out and they did that to her specifically. The men weren't stripped naked, only the woman. So that's a different sort of violence. And that is saying to all women, stay home. And that's what we have to counter as well, because we know that that sort of presentation, that sort of reporting has a really huge effect on the dynamics and the ambitions of young women like yourselves, young women around the world. When Julia Gillard is basically abused across the parliamentary floor because the opposition leader can say in parliament what he could never say outside parliament, then 75% of young women said, we're not going into politics. They're not going to go into politics. If that's what they're going to face, they're not going to go into politics. So these issues about how the environment permits things to be said and done to women, tragically, the murder of Joe Cox just about 2 weeks ago, we have all understood that abuse online is almost like a gateway to further levels of abuse and can lead to physical assault and danger. So the security issue has many ramifications. But just to leave that thought with you, that women's experience of these things is different from men's and has to be addressed differently.
Sounds like a whole nother panel of conversation, another part of the work. But I think to tie this up, looking at the clock and the time, is that we started off, and the title of this was Getting a Woman Elected, but I think it's how to run the winning candidate in a gendered culture, to borrow Sandra's term. So there's issues of threshold, there's issues of starting early, identifying people, there's issues of just sort of time burden, perception, networks, money, religion. The order of, is this politics, what's culture, what's politics, what's gender? What makes the winning candidate? I think just was summing up. And we started off by saying it's going to be a historic time in the United States, potentially. But just to leave you with a sort of a last figure, that currently there's 7 countries with new female leaders. We've got Scotland, we've got Mauritius, Myanmar, Nepal, Croatia, Lithuania, and Taiwan. And Taiwan's interesting, sort of going back to that question of someone coming not out of family politics, which is a different sort of leader for Southeast Asia. So the time is there, and let's see what we can do about continuing to change all of these other dynamics that feed into what is the winning candidate. I want to thank you all today for coming in, and thank you to the audience. Have a great day.
Some 75% of women who make it to top slot have been either foreign minister or security minister.
Isn't that right? It's something